Hello, I'm Micha Lanz. I'm the husband of Grace Lanz, Seamus's daughter, as you well know, and I'm a science teacher at Kilcomane Portadown. Seamus has asked me to share with you Psalm 78 today, so let's read it together. Now, it's quite a long one, and so I'm not going to cover all of it. We're just going to look at less than a third of it, which is 19 verses, verse 1 to 19. It says, "My people, hear my teaching. Listen to the words of my mouth. I'll open my mouth with a parable. I will utter hidden things from of old, things you have heard of and known, things our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their descendants, and will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders that he has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach their children, so that the next generation would know them, even the children not yet born, and they would in turn would tell their children. Then they would put their trust in God and would not forget his deeds, and would keep his commandments. They would not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation, whose hearts were not loyal to God, whose spirits were not faithful to him. The men of Ephraim, though armed with bows on the day of battle, turned their back. They did not keep the Lord's command. They refused to live by his law. They forgot what he had done, the wonders that he had shown them. He did miracles in their sight. And in the land of Egypt, in the region of Zoan, he divided the sea and led them through. He made the waters stand up like a wall. He guided them by the cloud by day, and by light from a fire by night. His spirit, he split the rocks in the wilderness, and gave them water as abundant as the seas. He brought streams out of the rocky crag. He made water flow like rivers. But they continued to sin against him, rebelling in the wilderness against the Most High. They willfully put God to the test by demanding the food they craved. They spoke against God. They said, "Can God really spread a table in the wilderness?" Have you ever been in a position where you're not sure what's going on? It all seems a bit out of control, and you don't know where to turn. There's a looming uncertainty or an uneasiness with every step as you go down life's path. It feels like a barren wilderness, dry, barren, lacking, and forgotten. We have this picture in the Old Testament. That is what the psalm here is referring to, when the Israelites were in the wilderness. That's where God led the Israelites, into the wilderness. So what happened? Why would God do that to his people? You see, for 400 years, the Israelites were kept in slavery. In anguish and in distress, they served the Egyptians until they cried out to God, and he saved them through Moses. God rescued his people with breathtaking miracles and displayed his awesome power. You might think, job done. God saved them. Off to the promised land. I can't wait. Land flowing with milk and honey and everything good. How soon can we get there? We certainly deserve it after all that time in slavery in Egypt. But that wasn't God's plan. Not at all. God did not lead Israel straight to the promised land. In his wisdom, he wanted to teach them an important lesson first, like a teacher imparting an important point before an exam. God led them into the wilderness to Mount Sinai. That's over 200 miles out of the way on foot in the heat. The Israelites spent over 2 years in the wilderness, waiting to enter the promised land God had said he would lead them into. I find that often God's way is different than my own. Now, sometimes I agree with God's path forward. Life is good, abundant, and full of happiness. However, at other times, God's way is sometimes confusing, difficult, long. Like with the Israelites, God sometimes takes us into the wilderness rather than taking us into the promised land, it seems. He takes a long way around, on a detour of difficulties. Why? Why would God do that? God knew that when his people reached the promised land, they would have a very hard time remembering who he was. When they're surrounded with all that is good, when they live comfortably in abundance, they would forget about God. They would think that everything they needed is right there in front of them. We don't need God anymore, they'd say. And even worse than all that, they'd forget who gave them all that is good. They would think that it's because of their own effort that they'd achieved this success. It was their own strength that had gotten all this. They'd forget the fact that God had saved them from Egypt. They'd forget that God has sustained them throughout the desert and all their journeys. And it was God who'd helped them possess the land that they so enjoyed now. The time in the wilderness was God ordained to teach Israel a very important lesson. It was to stop Israel from becoming proud and to make them understand that they needed God and are not wholly self-sufficient. Moses, when he talks to Israel before they enter the promised land, says this: "He led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness, that thirsty and waterless land, with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known." Why? It says this: "To humble and test you, that in the end it might go well with you." So the detour of difficulties in the wilderness wasn't a detour at all, but it was to teach an important lesson. Israel learned to rely on God to provide. They learned that God can guide them and give them all that they need. Psalm 78 is a very stern warning and calls the reader to remember the good that God has done for them and to trust Him. It also calls them to remember the discipline of God and the hardships they went through. As you read on past verse 19, which we read, it talks about God's discipline and wrath against Israel as they turn away again and again and again from the good that God had promised them. They kept wanting to go back to Egypt, into slavery, rather than trusting God and following Him. Now, for us today, we're far removed from all that, but we can learn from this psalm too. I admit that it's tough and certainly isn't easy reading. But you know what? Like the Israelites, we too were saved. Not out of Egypt, but we are saved from the slavery of sin. Like the Israelites, we are on a way to promised land. Not Palestine, but when we will be with God and everything will be made new. And so, as we're on this road today, and we're traveling this journey, there are two things we can take from Psalm 78. You know, when things are going well and we are surrounded by all that is good, we should remember God and thank Him rather than congratulating ourselves for all the good that we've achieved. Remember the wilderness and remember that all good comes from God. As it says in verse 7, "They will put their trust in God and would not forget His deeds, but would keep His commandments." Second thing we can learn is that when things aren't going well, when it feels like we're in the middle of the wilderness, to use Moses' words, the vast and dreadful wilderness, that thirsty and waterless land with its venomous snakes and scorpions. When we find ourselves there, learn the lessons that God is teaching you. I'm not saying that every difficulty is God's discipline. Far from it. That is untrue and is unbiblical. But every difficulty has an opportunity. In every difficulty lies opportunity to trust in God and to rely on Him for guidance and mercy. So when we are tempted to speak against God like the Israelites did in Psalm 78 and say, "Can God really spread a table in the wilderness?" When we ask that question in our heart, know in your heart, yes, God can. He knows what you need. He's done it before. and He will provide for you again. Trust in Him. That is the message of Psalm 78. Remember and trust in God. Thank you for listening.
Blessed be your name in the land that is plentiful, where the streams of abundance flow. Blessed be your name. Blessed be your name when I'm found in the desert place. Though I walk through the wilderness, blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Blessed be your name when the sun's shining down on me, when the world's all as it should be. Blessed be your name. Blessed